Welcome to the ATA Podcast, where each month we bring you news and insights from the American Translators Association. Let's get started with a few quick announcements.
The Science and Technology Division, not to be confused with the Language Technology Division, is a welcoming ATA community for language professionals in scientific and technical fields. Connect with like-minded professionals through our email group, virtual and in-person networking events, and social media. Whether you're experienced or just starting out, you will find support and community here. Join us today. Email us at divisions_td@atanet.org. Have a question or comment for ATA's Board of Directors? We want to hear from you. Your valuable input helps shape the future of our organization. Share your thoughts, feedback, or questions today by emailing president@atanet.org or any of the board members listed on the ATA website. It's your chance to be heard and make a difference.
Welcome back to the ATA podcast. I'm your host, Andy Ho, and today we're talking about standards in the language industry with Steve Lank. Steve is CEO of Denver-based Chesco Linguistic Services. With a career spanning over 38 years, Steve has held leadership roles around the world and has worked across nearly every facet of the language services industry, from freelancer to senior executive. He has been active in standards development since 1998 and chaired the ASTM subcommittee that developed the first translation standard in the U.S. He currently chairs the ASTM subcommittee for translation and is also a member of the ATA Standards Committee. As you can see, Steve is a trusted voice in the field, which is why I am speaking with him about standards today. Welcome, Steve.
Oh, thank you, Andy. I'm happy to be here.
All right, let's kick this off. I mentioned that you are on the ASTM subcommittee for translation. What is ASTM?
Okay, so broadly speaking, ASTM is an international standardization body. So they develop standards across, a variety of industries, many industries. It was established in 1898 as the American Society for Testing and Materials. So it's the oldest standards organization in the world, actually. And it was initially started in an effort to standardize railroad gauge, because at the time, in 1898, the turn of the century, lots of railroads were being built and lots of track was being laid with varying specifications. So these trains weren't able to cross borders and things like that. So that's how it started off. And then since then, it started out focusing on products and manufacturing, but since that time, it has developed to sort of take on even a wider range of topics and industries that weren't even considered at the time, right? So that includes language services. So lots of services have come in under the ASTM umbrella, and because of this emphasis on the expansion of what they actually work on standardizing, providing standards for, they rebranded in 2014 as ASTM International because they wanted to emphasize the fact that they were an international standardization body, although they're based here in the U.S., and also that they do more than just testing and materials, right? So it's still ASTM, which was the acronym for the American Society for Testing Materials, but now they've expanded and are covering lots and lots of things, including language services, and they have all over 13,000 published standards globally.
So ASTM officially no longer stands for anything then?
No. Well, I mean, like, people who know the history know what it is, but yeah, it's not officially the American Society for Testing and Materials anymore because it's moved beyond just the testing and materials part of their name.
When did the language part come into play? Is that a recent thing?
Relatively recently. I actually started with them in 1998 myself, which is 100 years after they were established. Our first standard in language industry was published in 1995, and that was the foreign language teaching standard, right? And then after that came, 2089, which is the interpreting standard, and the translation standard came after that. So the translation standard and the interpreting standard started to be developed in and around, in the mid 90s. and we were working with ASTM under the umbrella of their consumer products committee, which was everything. So, baby cribs, refrigerators, and language services were being covered. So made things a little bit more complicated. But we published, developed and published 3 standards prior to getting our own technical committee. So in 2011, after lots of work and advocacy for our industry, we were awarded our own technical committee. So the technical committee for language services and products, or products and services, I can't remember which order it goes in, was established in 2011. And since then, we've published additional standards in language services.
So what exactly is a standard? What does that mean? What rules are there? Who follows them? What are the rules?
Well, who follows them? Standards, the way ASTM is set up, and also ISO. ISO is the other organization that people will be aware of, the International Organization for Standardization, that publishes standards in lots of different industries. And the idea is there are groups that these are sort of consensus standards, meaning that they have to have balanced representation in the membership and the people developing the standards to make sure that all stakeholders are addressed. So these standards are developed by groups of people that are either working in an industry and have an interest in developing standards and best practices for their own industries, and people that are procuring those services or those products, or the ultimate end users of those services or products, and also just people who have general interest. So in the ASTM context, in that development, the requirement is that you cannot have, within the membership and within the drafting committees for the standards, you can't have more than 50% of the membership be people who are providers of the product or service. So anytime that membership goes higher. So we have a membership secretary in ASTM who monitors all that. And as soon as we're out of whack, we have to go and recruit additional membership. So they're very careful to ensure that the standards that are developed serve all the stakeholders. So it's not self-serve. So it's not just me, Steve, saying, "Oh, this is the way we should do things, and this works for me." It's got to be something that works for everybody, not just the providers, but also the people that are ultimately procuring the service or the product.
So once the standards are determined, are the standards, would you call them best practices? Is that a good description?
Yeah, I think so. My expertise is obviously language services and translation specifically, and sort of, what that looks like, in terms of manufacturing and things like that. It's also best practices, but they have stricter rules depending on which product is being produced. But yeah, it's basically sort of a way of enshrining, best practices, and they're, in order for, certainly from an ASTM perspective, to help educate people who are procuring a service understand what they should expect, right? They're great tools for providers as well, especially new people that are coming into an industry, to understand what best practices are and how they should be conducting their business and doing their business. But really, at least from the ASTM perspective, they're aimed at people who are procuring the service, so they can understand the types of questions that they should ask, or what they can expect, or the type of credentials that somebody should or might have, to help them, get ultimately what they need, right? Because if you're unable to, evaluate, what you're getting, which is the case for many people who are procuring language services, they just have to sort of trust that you are able to do what you're going to do. So in order for them to help them make those decisions about who to work with and how to work, these standards can help them do that.
So back to my question, are these standards recommendations? Do clients look these up and say, this is what I should look for when I purchase a service, and then abide by that?
Yes, well, it depends. On the ASTM side, and certainly, in any standards process, we have what you call standard guides in ASTM, and standard practices. Most standards, at least when we have done them on the language services, start out as guides. Like, this is guidance, these are best practices, this is what we suggest you do, right? this is how we suggest, services be provided, certainly from the provider side, right? In order to gain traction and acceptance of the standard. And then over time, and what they developed, which is exactly what happened with F2575, which is a translation standard, we moved from a guide to a practice, and a practice gives a standard more teeth and makes certain things requirements. So in sort of, standards parlance, you've got things that are, you've got shoulds and shalls, right? So shoulds are things that are basically, yeah, it would be great, we suggest that you do this, but, you don't have to. But the shalls are the things that you absolutely must do. So in F2575, which is the translation standard, that standard is sort of built around this concept of, you need to work with your client to come up with a set of, understand what they need, what they're trying to achieve, what their goals are, and come up with a set of specifications about what their need is, how are you going to go about processing that and giving them what they need, and in making that agreement up front. So in F2575 context, agreeing to these standards and setting up these specifications and setting up these specifications with the client and following through, saying what you're going to do, doing what you're going to do, and confirming that you did what you said you're going to do is the shall part. You must do that. But within the rest of the standard, there's certain things that you have some flexibility with. And certainly on the requester side, which is what we're calling the person who's procuring the service, we give them guidance on how they need to, this is what you should expect, or this is what you can expect. These are the types of credentials that you should be looking for when you're trying to vet, a provider for yourself. But we don't tell them you have to do this, you have to do that, you have to do this. We suggest that they do a risk analysis and other things that like most businesses are going to do anyway. But the shall part is actually the translation, is the process and coming to the agreement with the provider. And the other standards are similar. So once a standard becomes a practice in sort of in the ASTM context, when you have the shalls, then it's something that you can create, that you can be audited against and then get certified against, right? So you can, these are all, ASTM standards are what you call voluntary consensus standards. So you can sort of self-certify, basically. You can say, I'm following these standards. There's different ways that people can monitor that. But certification is with an which includes an audit by a third party, is the thing that has the most teeth for most clients. And so ASTM F2575 just became a practice in 2023, and now you can get certified against it. In fact, my company Chesco was the first company ever to be certified against F2575.
So what are some examples of these best practices?
Examples of best practices. Example of a best practice is to have a second, a second review of a translation, right? And to ensure that it's been reviewed by by a second person, ideally, or at least has been set aside and reviewed by the individual that's done the translation. So ensuring that there are multiple passes of review of a translation to ensure accuracy before it's delivered. Another best practice is just sort of look the types of credentials that you should consider. We list the types of competencies that a procurer of services should be looking at to understand who is best suited to provide the service for them to get the ultimate end result that they're looking for. So, is it enough to be bilingual? No, right? You need to look for training and experience. And so in the context of F2575, we give them, we don't say everybody must have this credential, because some credentials don't exist in some languages, but we say these are the types of things that you should look for, and these are the types of things that you should ask. We also, one of the new things that has been added most recently to F2575 is the concept of labeling translations as something, labeling a translation as either automated translation or something that has been at least reviewed by a professional translator. That was first enshrined in the standard in 2023, and in 2025 we just updated and balloted making some slight adjustments to the language in there to make the labels more targeted, more specific. So it is suggested in the as a best practice that whoever's publishing a translation label it as either unverified translation, which it means it's raw, or professionally verified translation. So a professionally verified translation can be a translation that was auto-generated but then reviewed and edited by a professional, or it can be something that's been human from beginning to end. Well, professionally human, because under the unverified translation label in the F2575 context, some translation that's been done by a person who's not professionally trained or who's not a professional translator is considered unverified unless it's reviewed by a professional.
So I remember about 10 years ago or so, ISO certification was the thing that everybody talked about.
Mm-hmm.
How is this different? You mentioned ISO.
I consider them sister standards. ISO in there are sort of good in different contexts. ISO focuses a lot more. The ISO 17100, which we are up with, which Tesco is also certified against, and I suggest people try to get certified to both. Focuses much more on the credentials of the translators, and of specific requirements in the process. Whereas ASTM is about the specifications process. It also talks about credentialing and the process very, very clearly. It sets up this there's a beautiful swim lane diagram in F2575 about the complexity of the process and the best practice. But they focus on different things. So the part of the main focus of F2575 is presenting these best practices to your client, but coming to the agreement on specifications and the suggestion of what credentials are. The ISO standard is much more prescriptive about what the credentialing is, because it's coming from a much more European context, whereas the ASTM is from a much more sort of US context. Even though both they're sort of applicable across the board, the requirements in the ISO standard for credentials are very strict, because they're much more focused on the European languages where those credentials exist, to the training that exists. In the US context, we can't say, for example, that for Spanish, French, and German, the Western European languages that you're doing, that it's easier to find people, for example, that have ATA certification, right? But I often will see RFPs where a client says, I have 200 languages that I need to have supported, and all of them need to be ATA certified. And it's like, well, that's not possible because those certifications don't exist. So in the ASTM context, it's we say these are the types of credentials you should look for, and this is what you can expect. But in some, they don't all exist in all contexts. So, ISO still is a focus, and I think it's important to look at both and consider both, because there's a lot of overlap in the standards. A lot of it also has to do with sort of jumping ahead to something that we probably will talk to later. So if I'm getting ahead of myself, you can tell me. But standards are kind of a shorthand for a client who doesn't understand what you do or can't evaluate what you do, that you have a process in place that can be audited, that shows that you follow best practices, right? So if if somebody's talking about manufacturing, I don't know, widgets, and I don't understand widgets, at least I know that they have these, if they comply with these standards, or if they're certified against them, at least I know that they have a process in place and somebody has audited them, or there's a possibility of being audited. So that gives me sort of comfort that I'm going to get what I need from this person, as opposed to somebody who maybe doesn't follow a standard or doesn't have that in place. And it's also great shorthand for particularly for clients who work in regulated industries themselves, or if they've got a certification themselves that they get audited against. If they see that you also have one that's in that same family of standards, that also gives them more comfort. So this is why I'm saying, like, if you've got a client who is ISO in their industry, ISO compliant or ISO certified, maybe you want to consider the one because that's going to be more resonate more with them. And then on the ASTM side, you look at that and decide. So it's kind of, in terms of, I think clients, depending who the client is, some clients don't seem to care, they don't know, but it's up to us to make them care about best practices, right? But I think it is great shorthand to show that you've got best practices in place. And plus, standards are a way of signaling to the world that you're a serious profession and you're a serious industry, serious enough to sort of self-regulate. So nobody has imposed these standards on us. I mean, translation and interpreting in the US are not regulated federally, right? So it's up to us to regulate ourselves, right? So by developing these standards and presenting them to the world, we're showing them that, there is a process that needs to be followed. It is complex. Not just anybody can do it, and we take ourselves serious enough to go through this process. And then over time, clients start to adopt. So really, it starts from in most cases, the sort of the initial spark to develop a standard is going to come from the providers themselves or the manufacturers themselves. They're going to say, look, we see all these different things happening. We are sending mixed messages to the market right now because everybody's doing something different. We need to sort of get it all together and organize ourselves in a way that shows that we're all, aiming for the same thing and focusing on, and also to sort of get people on the peripheries who are sort of hangers-on, or what I call in our industry hobbyists, people who do the work casually, but it isn't how they're making their living, or they're not focused on it. Having those standards in place signals to the market that we're serious. So I think that that's important too. Even independent, even if your clients don't seem to care about it, which is an argument that you'll get from people. Well, it doesn't matter. Well, it doesn't matter now, maybe, or they don't think it's important. But once they sort of see what it is and what the standards follows, working with somebody who follows those standards can bring to them, I think they start to see the value. And we're starting to see more and more. I mean, it's taken decades. I mean, I've been working since 1998 on these standards, but on the state government side, less on the federal government side, although we are starting to see it, we see ASTM standards referenced in language services RFPs. ISO, started being recognized first, that 17100, because 17100 was published in 2015. Most recently, the first ASTM standard was 2006, but ISO started to get traction as something to be certified against in Europe much earlier, right? So, but I think that it just having those standards in place, signals that you're serious, and then people start to come on board. And like I said, ISO is being referenced, ASTM is being referenced, and I'm happy to say also that ATA certification is being referenced in state government RFPs as well, in particular. Now, sometimes they're misquoted, or it's kind of in name only, like they know that they exist, which is good, because before they didn't know that we existed as an industry, so now they do. They didn't know that these standards existed or these certifications existed, but now they do. But sometimes you get the thing where, well, I need 200 languages and they all have to be ATA certified. And then you have to go back and do a little bit of education, but they're great education tools for that reason. So you could, and the beauty of a standard that is published by an established authoritative third party is that it gives you coverage, right? It gives you cover. So if you go back to a client and they said, oh, well, we want you to do this, and you can go back and say, well, I can't do that. It's not me, Steve, saying I can't do that because I don't want to do it. Best practices on our industry standards, we follow industry standards, and it doesn't allow me to do that. And it's much easier to have that conversation with the client because it takes the personal part out of it, or the emotional part out of it, and it sort of, and again, it gives you more credibility if you are referencing a third-party standard. And I also think that following a third-party standard helps to build trust in a client, again, for a client who, again, is not able to evaluate really what they're getting from you.
So I see the direct connection between ASTM standards, client desires, client needs, and an agency like yours.
Right.
But for an average freelancer like me, how does ASTM come into play in my life, in my professional work?
Well, I think ASTM, I think, well, I think that it's good to know. I mean, you'll know this, Andy, from working with clients that you may have who have a certification, whether it's ASTM or ISO. They have requirements of you. So they have to document who they're working with. We have to document who we're working with and confirm that the professionals that we choose to work with meet the requirements of the standard, right? So you're going to find, so I think it's important for independent contractors, freelance professionals to understand what it is in the standard, what the best practices that, what the process is that appears in the standard, to make sure that you're following it yourself in terms of the piece of the puzzle that is yours, right? But also what the credentialing requirements are, or the years of, the experience, office training and things, and sort of the competencies that agencies like Chesco and others are looking for in the professionals that they work with, not only because they know that it will bring the best result for our clients, but also because it's what the standards require. So in the case of ASTM, I mean, the ASTM standard, I mean, all these standards, ISO ones, the ASTM ones, they have to be purchased. Right, so you have to buy them. I mean, I wish I could just spread the word and pass them on to everybody, but this is how these organizations make their money, so they sell the standards. But we have 6 standards within F43 and ASTM. To be a member of ASTM, I think I think the membership is $115 a year, but that gives you access to all of the standards in the library for ASTM, for F43, for the language services, which if you bought them separately, I think it would be like $500 something. So you're saving money by doing that. It also gives you the opportunity to be involved in the development of standards. ASTM, whereas ISO is, they also develop their consensus standards, so they have the same idea of balance. But the members of ISO who participate in standards development are national standards bodies, right? So each national standard body for all of the countries that are working on a standard send representation to sort of negotiate and talk about and help develop. But when it comes to balloting and voting, it's one vote, one country, one vote. So a country like the U.S., such a big industry, large population, has the same voting power as Liechtenstein. Not that I have any problems with Liechtenstein, but a lot fewer people there, a lot smaller industry there than there. So it's a little bit different. In ASTM, individuals can be members, right? So your individual voice can be heard as a member in terms of voting on a standard. So because of those setups, ASTM standards tend to be more detailed, right, than ISO standards. Not that one is better than the other, but I think there's a lot more clarity in an ASTM standard because they've gone through this process. It's very, very sort of detailed process where you've got individuals working on it, as opposed to the ISO process, which obviously has published wonderful standards that are used and are very effective, but the process of getting to them makes them, watered down is not the right word, but like you have to sort of, to try to sort of find something that all these different organizations are going to agree to is a little bit harder and more time consuming. So they tend to be a little bit more sort of higher level. They address the same things, but in a higher level, to sort of in an effort to try to please everyone, which is not really the best way of saying that, but the ASTM ones end up being much more detailed. I mean, I can't tell you the amount of discussions we have over when you have a bunch of language nerds together, punctuation.
Oh, I can imagine.
In the
I
standard.
can imagine.
Yeah.
All right. right. Well, Steve, this has been a very thorough explanation. We only have a couple minutes left. Is there any final message you'd like to give the audience?
Well, I would just like to say that, do investigate membership in ASTM and sort of acquaint yourself with the standards. I mean, in ASTM F25, F43, we do have six standards. So we have the language training standard, we have the interpreting standard, which everybody's familiar with. We have the translation standard, but there's also a standard on language proficiency testing, one for language service companies. We're developing one right now on captioning that's being balloted. We're working on one for remote interpreting. So there's all this work that's ongoing, and if you find yourself, you are able to, as a member, participate in the review of standards as they're being developed, and to sort of have your specific voice heard, and sort of know what's in development, and even to suggest things that you think might need to be addressed. And the beauty of these standards is they are living documents. It's not that we publish them and they're done forever. They have to be updated at a minimum every 8 years. But then if new things have come up over a period of time that's less than that, you can reballot certain aspects of it. F2575 originally published in 2006. It published again in 2014. We published a significant update in 2023 where it moved from a guide to a practice. And then this year in 2025, we have updated it slightly to make that change to the labeling portion. So it's a good way to get involved in standards if you're interested, to sort of understand what best practices are, and also to sort of have your voice heard. If you see something that you think should be adjusted, or you would like to see addressed, you can do that within the ASTM process. So I encourage people to do that.
All right. Well, thank you very much for this explanation. And you heard what Steve said. Think about this. Think about getting involved and being a part of the industry. Thank you for being here today, Steve.
Thank you so much for having me, Andy. I appreciate it.
That's a wrap. To learn more about the American Translators Association, including how to join, visit atanet.org. Until next time.